providence. But I will also provide a little bit of a review of what we covered last time we were in the book of Mark. And so if you would, please turn with me in the book of Mark to chapter 3. It's where we left off, but I'm going to go back a few verses and cover kind of what Jesus just went through before we get to verses 7 through 8. If you remember way back a few weeks ago, we were talking about Jesus being in the synagogue. And there was a man there with a withered hand. And there were some Sadducees and Pharisees, Jewish officials, that were grumbling and wondering what Jesus was going to do. And in their heart, they were looking for something to accuse him of. I mean, it didn't matter if Jesus just picked his nose. That was going to be some sort of egregious breach of the law. And they were going to accuse him of something because that's what they were looking to do. That's what was in their heart. And Jesus confronts them and says, is it better to heal or to leave this man sick, even if it's on the Sabbath? And so in a miraculous sign, doing no work whatsoever, he heals this man's withered hand. The result of that is that these Jewish officials' hearts are hardened even more. So much so that they seek out the Herodians. Now these people were the enemies of the Jewish officials, the enemies of the Sadducees and Pharisees. We might think of them as fake Jews. These are people that take on that title simply for their own personal gain. See, they're governing in a Jewish nation, and so to try to get the confidence and the power of the people, they call themselves Jews, but that's only in title and in name, because really when it comes to following God's statutes, they do none of it. And that drives the Pharisees and the Sadducees nuts, because they are all about following God's law. And yet, here they are going to them, seeking friendship and assistance. Why? Because their hatred for the Son of God runs so incredibly deep that the very people that they hate, they are willing to make friends with. The people that don't follow God's law, they are willing to seek assistance from, simply so they can destroy the Son of God. The title of that message was The Consequences of Not Knowing Them, Not Knowing Him. And the consequences are clear for these Jewish officials. The title of this message is The Consequences of Knowing Him, because what we see here is now an incredible contrast between the Jewish officials and these other, shall we say, regular people that now come to follow Jesus, beginning in verse 7 of Mark chapter 3. After these events that we've just spoken of, Jesus withdrew to the sea with his disciples, and a great multitude from Galilee followed, and also from Judea, and from Jerusalem, and from Idumea, and beyond the Jordan, in the vicinity of Tyre and Sidon. A great number of people heard of all that he was doing and came to him. It's incredible to note here that the Sadducees and the Pharisees are upset with Jesus. They're judging Jesus. They're blaming Jesus, accusing him because of what he has done. And yet now you have a group of people or groups of people that are traveling long distances to be near him, to follow him, to sit at his feet, to hear his teaching. Why? Because of what he has done. You have two distinct peoples that are seeing the same exact events. One is judging him to be of Satan, and the other is judging him to be of God. And that's the crux of our message, the point. I shouldn't use crux. Made too many mistakes with that word. That is the point of our message this morning, is being able to discern who Jesus really is. So the question is, how do these people know? I mean, the Sadducees and the Pharisees that have gone through the law and studied the law, I mean, they make a job of it. How could they miss him? Yet these regular people know who Jesus is. Surely they would have known the words in Isaiah. Isaiah was one of maybe the most important prophets in the Jewish religion at the time. They would have known his book. It would have been preached in the synagogue. It was something that would have been quoted regularly. And so they would have surely known the words in Isaiah chapter 35, verses 5 through 6. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. Then the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute will shout for joy. For waters will break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the Arabah. Surely they would have known these words. And so when Jesus comes, just as Isaiah is talking about the incredible future that God has set for Zion, his people, for Jerusalem, surely they would have heard what Jesus was doing, healing the sick, making the blind to see, making the lame to walk, the mute that were demon-possessed now speak. And surely they would have brought back to their mind Isaiah, and they would have gone, it's time. The year of Jubilee is here. God is bringing his kingdom down to us. We got to go. It is time to be near this man. Surely they would have recognized it. John, in his gospel, sets forth for us a similar example. He bears witness to us another experience that Jesus has here on earth. It's found in John chapter 9. Jesus is walking with his disciples, and he comes across a man born blind. And even his disciples are still, their minds are still set on the law. Who has sinned, they ask him. Who has sinned? Who made the mistake? His mom or dad? Whose issue, whose mistake is this man the consequence of? This sickness, this illness, the result of? And Jesus' answer is very simple. It was neither that this man sinned, this is verse 3, chapter 9 of the Gospel of John. It was neither that this man sinned nor his parents, but it was so that the works, the doings of God might be displayed in him. See, this man wasn't born blind because of some mistake, because of some wrongdoing. He was made born blind so that we could walk by here, you could ask this question, and then in my healing him, you could know who I am. Not just because I tell you, not just because I announce myself, but because you are seeing the works of God being done through my hands. That's why this man was born blind. That's the point of everything that I'm doing. That all this work is a sign for you of a great and gracious and forgiving and loving God. They don't believe him. The disciples may come, or the disciples do come to believe him. But this is still a struggle for the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the other Jewish officials. This man goes through town, and everyone's amazed. How can you see now? And he starts to tell his story about this guy that came along and spit in some ground, made some clay, and rubbed it on his eyes and told him to go bathe, and now he can see. So they bring him before the Jewish officials. And in verse 16, they're questioning. Therefore, some of the Pharisees were saying, this man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath. But others are saying, how can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? Good point, right? Is God going to bless sin? And there was a division among them. Those that see God's works classify them as being from Satan, and those that see God's works and classifying them from being from a loving, caring, merciful God. They ask his parents, and his parents get out of it by saying, we're not in this. You ask him. He's old enough to answer the question. You ask him again. So they do. They ask him again. And then by this point, the guy's like, are you not hearing me? Or maybe you want to be his disciple too. And at that point, they're, oh, no, that does not go over well. No, they're disciples of Moses. He answered them, this is verse 25. He answered them, I told you already, and you do not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? You do not want to become his disciples too, do you? Oh, and they get upset. And finally, the man is done. He's like, listen, you're the one with all the schooling. You're the one with all the education. You guys should know the answer to this stuff. I don't know why you keep bothering me. So finally, the answer to the last question, he says, verse 30, the man answered them and said to them, well, here's an amazing thing, that you don't know where he's from. That's the amazing thing, is that you see this incredible work from God, and that you guys still don't get it. That's what's amazing to me. And yet, he opened my eyes. We know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he hears them. Since the beginning of time, it has never been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If the man were not from God, he could do nothing. Clearly, this man has decided who Jesus is and where he comes from. And he will, by walking through town, end up at Jesus' side again, and Jesus will ask him, who did this? And he says, I don't know, show me and I will worship him. And Jesus says, I was the one, and he will proclaim Jesus to be the Messiah in that moment. Not because Jesus told him, but because of what Jesus had done. He'd already decided in his heart that the work that he had experienced in his own personal life was of God and of no one else. And that was what he was going to receive as the blessing, the testimony of his life. So it's not like this is new to God. If you think that this is a new experience, we only need to go back as far as Exodus, and when God rescues the Jews from Egypt, to find that this is a common problem. This is something that God must endure or has endured before. If you remember, the Jews are in bondage, they're in slavery in Egypt, and God saves them through a bunch of miraculous signs through the ministry of Moses, and they are now headed to the promised land. And they bumble a few times, but they finally get to the edge of the promised land, and God says, send out some spies, go look at the place. Check out the place I have for you. Milk and honey and all these wonderful things. Go and look at it. Go and check out the goodness that I have in store for you in your future. And the spies go over and they look, and they see the goodness. They bring back some of the fruits that grow in that area. They also see some of the people that live there and some of the fortifications. And this is the report that they bring back in Exodus chapter 13, verse 31. But the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are too strong for us. So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone and spying it out is a land that it devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great size. The land flowing with milk and honey. The land that God has provisioned for them. He is just going to hand it to them. And they bring back a lie about what God has, the incredible blessing. They report it as a curse. And God's response to Moses in chapter 14, verse 11 is, the Lord said to Moses, how long will this people spurn me? And how long will they not believe in me, despite all the signs which I have performed in their midst? I can tell them that I'm their God, but listen, I have done all these incredible things to show them I am their God. I mean, tell tell me you love me, and that's one thing. But show me you love me, that's a whole other ballgame. And I have shown them over and over again that I love them. And yet they continue to walk away. So why does Jesus not just tell them? Why does he not just say it? I am the Messiah. I am God's Son. I am the one that has come here to save you. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because he does. All we have to do is, if you're still in John chapter 9, turn over a page, you might have to. John chapter 10. He does that. The Jews ask him in verse 24 of John chapter 10. The Jews then gathered around him, were saying to him, how long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly. Just say it. Jesus answered them, I told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name, these testify of me. I've already told you, and you've already seen it. You've seen the works that I do. And I've told you the works tell you who I am. Verse 30, I and the Father are one. Tell us plainly, okay, I and the Father are one. I'm the Messiah you've been waiting for. What's the response? The Jews picked up stones again to stone him. Can you hear those words from Exodus in Jesus' response to them? I showed you many good works from the Father. For which of them are you stoning me? I've done all these amazing things. Why do you continue to spurn me? Why do you continue to deny me after I show you love and mercy and grace? The Jews answered him, for a good work we do not stone you, but for blasphemy, and because you, being a man, make yourself out to be God. That's what you just asked me to do. That's what you wanted to know. Jesus continues, verse 37, if I do not do the works of my Father, do not believe in me. Pretty clear, right? If I'm not forgiving, if I'm not loving, if I'm not healing, if I'm not performing incredible miracles of creation, then don't believe that I'm him. But if I do them, though you do not believe me, believe the works, so that you may know and understand that the Father is in me, and I in the Father. If you don't believe it when I say that I love you, believe the things that I do that show you that I love you. So what does this mean for us today? What's the practical application? What's the point? Number one, know the works of God. When you look out at creation and you see the beauty of all that he has made, do you see random chemicals and molecules just happening to bump together and explode and then make a tree? Or do you see the handiwork of God? If I could, on a quick aside, recently I was reading an article about a rock, an asteroid of some sort, that was elongated. It was shaped like a, I guess kind of like a baseball bat or something, like a tree limb. It wasn't round. It was elongated like a tube. And it sped past Earth, I guess, pretty close. It was a rock. Because of its shape, there were all these scientists that got together and they were like, this is amazing, look at this thing, it's so weird looking. You know what their conclusion was? Someone must have made it. A rock! They look at this and they say, no, random chance. They can look at a rock flying through space through telescopes hundreds of miles away and come up with intelligent design. But they can look at all this amazingness, the birds of the air that sing through my window in the morning, the giraffes with those huge long necks, all that. And they come up with, nope, just happened by chance. kidding me? Can you hear God just, how long will you spurn me? How long will you look at the magnificent works that I make and attribute it to something else and not me? Know the works of God. And you know the works of God by reading his word. Dive into his word. Know what he does. Know what he's about. Know what he has called you to do. And that's point number 2, what he has called you to do. If we look in Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47, we find the church after Pentecost when the Holy Spirit has come down on them and gifted them with incredible gifts to do God's ministry here on earth. And what we do is we find an incredible growth in the church. Incredible growth in the church. But what I want you to see is some of it is due to people like Peter boldly and courageously preaching the gospel. But there's other things that are going on. Acts chapter 2, starting in verse 42. They were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching, and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. Everyone kept feeling a sense of awe, and many wonders and signs were taking place through the apostles. And all those who had believed were together and had all things in common. And they began selling their property and possessions and were sharing them with all, as anyone might have need. Day by day, continuing with one mind in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, they were taking their meals together with gladness and sincerity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord was adding to their number day by day those who were being saved. How are they adding to their number? By doing the work of God. Why? Because it is a sign of whose we are. This has nothing to do with salvation. Nothing to do with salvation. Salvation is of faith and faith alone. But we show others who we are by the work that we do. If we are truly going to model Christ and use him as an example, when he looks at those around us and says, "Judge me by what I have done," what are you accusing me of? Of love, of mercy, of forgiveness? Guilty, because that makes me the Son of God. May we all be able to do that at some point. May we all be able to face our accusers at some point and be able to say, what are you judging me for? Feeding the hungry? Healing the sick? Clothing the naked? Giving shelter to the homeless? Sure, guilty. That makes me a son of God. Do the works that God has called you to do. It will be a sign to others of who you are. And they won't be able to help but want to be near you. Amen?
Amen.
If you would please stand and sing our final hymn together. Jesus, I come. The words of it can be found on the screen at the front of the sanctuary.